It was a bitterly cold night in the small village at the edge of the world. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing everything in white. The streets were empty, silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the crunch of footsteps in the snow, the soft whisper of wind that carried the scent of ice and frost. A man trudged through the snow, his face hidden beneath a thick scarf, his coat wrapped tightly round his body. He had been walking for hours, looking for shelter, but the storm seemed to be getting worse, not better. He needed warmth, food, and rest. As he turned a corner, he stopped. His eyes narrowed as he saw something in the distance. There, in the middle of the street, lying motionless in the snow, was a small figure. For a moment, he thought it might be an animal, or maybe a pile of snow. But as he drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a small, fragile child, curled up and covered in snow. He knelt down beside her, his breath coming out in heavy clouds of steam. The child was so still, so pale, her silver hair shining like starlight in the moon's faint glow. Her face was delicate, almost too delicate, with smooth skin that looked almost inhuman. Her tiny body was covered in a thin coat, but it was no match for the biting cold that had clearly numbed her. She looked like a lost dream, as if she didn't belong in this world. The man's hands trembled as he reached down, gently brushing the snow from her face. She was cold, so cold. Her skin was like ice, and her little chest barely rose with each breath. He could hardly believe his eyes. How could a child be out here, alone, in the middle of the night? And where did she come from? His mind raced with questions, none of which had an answer. The child's silver hair shimmered even in the dim light, and her face, though small and childlike, held an expression that seemed ancient, a look that didn't belong to someone so young. Her eyes were shut tight, her lips barely moving, but he could feel the faintest warmth beneath her skin. He looked around again, but there was no one else, no signs of anyone else nearby. It was as if she had fallen from the sky itself, or appeared out of nowhere. The village was empty, the houses distant and quiet. A sense of unease crept up his spine. Should he leave her here? Should he try to help? His instinct screamed at him to turn away, but there was something in the child's stillness, something in her frailty, that made him want to act. Without thinking, he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. She was so light, almost weightless, like a doll made of porcelain. Her face was pressed against his coat, her breath warm against his skin, but still so fragile. He moved quickly, stumbling through the snow, desperate to find shelter. The storm seemed to grow stronger with every step, the wind howling around them, biting through his clothing and cutting into his skin. As he moved, he could feel her stir slightly in his arms. Her small fingers twitched, and for a moment, he thought she might be waking up. But then she went still again. Was she even conscious? Was she alive? The questions weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't stop. He had to get her out of the storm, out of the cold. Every step he took felt like a fight against time. The night seemed to grow darker, the snow falling heavier, but his resolve was clear. He would not leave her in the snow. He couldn't. He finally spotted a small, abandoned building in the distance. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. He rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The building was dark inside, but it offered shelter from the storm. As he stepped inside, the child still unconscious in his arms, he felt a momentary sense of relief. But that feeling quickly faded as he turned to look back at the dark night outside. Who was this child? How had she ended up here alone? And most of all, why did he feel this overwhelming need to protect her, even though he knew nothing about her? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was for sure: his life was about to change forever. The wind howled outside, but inside the abandoned building, there was only the soft crackling of a small fire he'd managed to start. The human sat by the fire, his coat still wrapped around the tiny alien child in his arms. He stared down at her, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Her silver hair glimmered in the firelight, and her delicate features looked even more fragile now that she was out of the storm's grip. But despite the warmth around her, she remained still, her chest rising and falling with shallow, slow breaths. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. It felt warm, but still too cold to be considered safe. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could try to find help, but he had no idea where to even begin. This place was remote, isolated. There were no other signs of life for miles. Who could he turn to? And if there were others, were they even friendly? Something about the girl, something about her eyes made him feel like there was more to the situation than just finding a lost child. He sighed and pulled her a little closer, wrapping her in his arms more tightly, hoping the warmth would help her. He'd never seen anything like her before. She was unlike any human child, but also unlike any creature he had ever encountered. Her skin had a strange, almost ethereal glow to it, and her eyes, though they were closed, seemed to shimmer like they were made of stardust. What had happened to her? How had she ended up alone in the snow? 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but no answers came. He had to focus on the moment. She needed him now, not in some distant future when the answers were found. He couldn't lose her to the cold. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him he couldn't let her go. He shifted, moving to sit against the stone wall, still holding the child. The fire crackled softly in front of them, and the warmth from it seemed to bring a little life back into her. Her breathing became steadier, and her small fingers twitched once more. His heart skipped a beat. Was she waking up? For a few minutes, nothing happened, and he began to doubt if she was even capable of waking. Just as the doubt began to creep in, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, the faintest of movements at first. Then, slowly, her eyes opened, revealing dark, deep pupils that seemed to pull him in. It was as if she had been asleep for ages and had just woken from a dream. Her gaze met his, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. She blinked a few times, and the look on her face was one of confusion and fear. Her eyes darted around the room, as though she was unsure of where she was or even who she was. Then, her gaze finally settled on him again, her lips parting as if she was about to speak. "Who are you?" Her voice was soft, like the sound of a distant echo, but it carried a weight that made him freeze. It wasn't the voice of a child who had just woken up from a nap. It was the voice of someone who had seen much, far more than her young appearance suggested. I'm just a traveler," he stammered, not knowing how to explain himself. "I found you outside, in the snow." His mind raced for the right words, but nothing felt right. What could he say to explain all this? What could he tell her when he barely understood it himself? The girl's gaze didn't break from his. There was something almost ancient in the way she looked at him, like she knew more about him than he did about her. Her eyes seemed to study him carefully, almost as if she was weighing him, measuring his every movement. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with quiet gratitude. But there was something else in her tone, a deeper meaning that he couldn't quite grasp. For a brief moment, they simply sat in silence, the crackling fire the only sound between them. The room felt small, too small for the weight of the questions that hung in the air. What had brought her to this cold world? What was she really? The human's heart pounded as the mystery deepened. The answers were just out of reach, hidden beneath the surface. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answers. The more he learned, the more dangerous this would become. But there was no turning back now. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the room, as if to remind him that what he had found was just the beginning of something far bigger. The fire crackled softly in the corner, its warmth filling the small room as the alien child sat up, still wrapped in the human's coat. The warmth of the fire seemed to invigorate her, but her eyes remained distant, as if trapped in a world far beyond the cold stone walls around them. She didn't speak again, but her gaze never left the human, an intensity in her stare that sent a chill through him despite the heat of the flames. The man shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? What had brought her to this desolate place, alone in the snow? Her silence only deepened the mystery, and the weight of it pressed down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a lost child. She had an air of wisdom, an oldness to her that didn't match her small, fragile body. She wasn't from this world, that much was clear. But why was she here? What happened to you? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt awkward, as if they weren't enough to convey the complexity of the situation. The girl blinked slowly, as if contemplating his question, but she didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flickered to the window, where the storm outside continued to rage, and for a moment, he thought she might have forgotten him altogether. Then, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was lost. Her words were simple, but there was a haunting sorrow in them. My people, they're gone. His heart clenched as he listened to her. His mind struggled to make sense of her words. Your people, where are they? What happened? He asked, his voice filled with concern. The girl's gaze turned inward, as if reliving memories she could never forget. They came. The invaders, she said, her voice trembling slightly. They took everything. My home, my family. It was all gone. I was the last. But then, I was brought here. Her voice trailed off, and she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. The vulnerability in her eyes made him feel an ache in his chest, a deep empathy for this alien child who had experienced so much loss. The human felt a tight knot form in his throat. He had no idea how to respond. His world was so different from hers, so peaceful in comparison. He couldn't fathom the kind of pain she must have endured. Yet, despite the darkness in her past, she still had a spark in her, a spark that refused to be extinguished. I don't understand, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Why did you end up here, in the middle of nowhere? How did you survive? The girl's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something almost like hope. I don't know, she said softly. I wanted to live. I had to find a way. She paused, as if weighing something in her mind. And now, I'm here. With you. The human stared at her, unsure of what to say next. He felt a strange pull, an overwhelming desire to protect this child from whatever horrors she had experienced. He didn't know how or why, but he knew he couldn't leave her alone again, outside. The storm continued its furious assault on the world, but inside the room, there was a quiet stillness. The girl's presence was both a mystery and a gift, and he couldn't help but feel that their meeting was no accident. Something had brought them together in this isolated, frozen place, and for better or worse, they were now connected. His gaze shifted to the window, the night stretching endlessly beyond the small building. There were answers out there, he knew it, but right now, all he could do was sit beside her and keep her safe. The world could wait. For now, the girl was his responsibility. The wind howled again, louder than before, but this time, it didn't seem as threatening. The fire crackled louder, as if it too was trying to warm not just the body, but the soul of the small alien child sitting beside him. The mystery of her past still hung in the air like a thick fog, but one thing was clear: she wasn't alone anymore, and as long as he could help it, she wouldn't be again. The hours passed in a quiet, uneasy stillness, the fire flickering low as the storm outside continued to rage. The human sat beside the alien child, his mind swirling with questions. Every now and then he would glance at her, but she was still distant, her thoughts far away, as if caught between two worlds. Her small body was wrapped in his coat, but she still seemed fragile, like something that could break if handled too roughly. He had tried to speak to her again, but her answers were always short, distant. She wasn't being cold, not really, but something about her made him feel like an outsider, like she was holding back, guarding something. He didn't push her, though. She had already been through enough, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel more alone. As the fire burned lower, he glanced out the window again. The storm hadn't shown any sign of letting up, and the darkness outside seemed to stretch endlessly. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the cold seeped deeper into his bones, and a strange sense of unease began to gnaw at him. He glanced down at the girl again, noticing the way she seemed to be watching him. There was an intensity in her gaze, like she was seeing right through him. It made him shift uncomfortably. She wasn't just any child. She had knowledge, something more than just the trauma of her past. It was something deeper, something ancient. I know what you're thinking, she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Her words were simple, but the way she spoke them made him stop, as if she had read his mind. You think I'm different, that I'm not like you. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face must have told her enough. She didn't wait for him to answer, instead looking down at her small hands, her fingers twisting the edges of his coat. I am different, she continued. I'm not just a child. I'm something else, something old, I've seen things. Things no one should ever see." Her voice was soft, but there was a weight to it, as if she was trying to carry the burden of memories she couldn't let go of. "My people, they were ancient, travelers of the stars. We lived for a long time, longer than any human. We saw worlds rise and fall, but we never thought we would be destroyed." The human didn't know what to say. His mind raced, but he couldn't find the right words. He had never imagined anything like this, never even considered the possibility of an ancient alien race, let alone one that had been wiped out. She was the last of her kind, and here she was, sitting in front of him, telling him things that sounded impossible. "They came," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The invaders. They wiped us out, one by one. They took everything. Our cities, our people, our history. It all vanished, and I was the only one left." Her eyes met his again, and for the first time, the human saw a flash of something other than fear in her gaze. Anger. She was angry, not just for herself, but for everything that had been lost. Her entire world had been erased, and she had survived it, alone. She was the last piece of a shattered past. The human swallowed hard. "How did you survive?" he asked, his voice rough. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. Until I found this place." Her words were steady, but there was something in them that unsettled him. She wasn't just telling a story. She was living it. The cold in her eyes, the way she spoke, it was like she had already accepted the loss, but still carried the weight of it. The room seemed to grow colder, even with the fire burning in the corner. The world outside was still lost to the storm, but here, inside, the alien child's words had begun to crack open something that felt heavier than just snow and ice. The human sat there, unsure of what to do next. He had already made a decision to help her, to keep her safe. But now, more than ever, he felt the gravity of the situation. She wasn't just an orphan, she was the last of a race. And with that came a responsibility far beyond anything he had imagined. He looked at her again, and this time, it was clear. The journey ahead wasn't just about survival. It was about something much greater, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew. But there was no turning back. The fire had burned low, its embers casting faint shadows across the room. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, a strange calm had settled over them. The alien child sat on the floor, her legs crossed in front of her, her eyes fixed on the dying fire. The human, still unsure of what to do, sat nearby, his back against the cold stone wall. He hadn't spoken in a while. The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on him with a heaviness he couldn't shake. She was the last of her kind, a survivor of a war that had wiped out an entire race. And now, she was here with him, in this isolated building. There was an unspoken tension between them, an understanding that neither of them fully grasped. She had seen destruction, pain, and loss beyond anything he could comprehend. And he, a stranger in her world, had stumbled into her life at the most crucial moment. Their bond was fragile, like the thin ice covering a deep lake. One wrong move, and it could shatter. The child's voice broke the silence once again, this time softer, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to be the last." Her words were heavy with sorrow, and the human could hear the weight of 1,000 memories in her voice. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to be the last of an entire race, to carry the burden of a dying world on your shoulders. He couldn't fathom the loneliness she must have felt, the emptiness of having no one left to turn to, no family to lean on. It was a crushing thought. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, unsure if his words were enough. How could they be? What comfort could he possibly offer to someone who had seen the end of everything she had ever known? The girl looked up at him then, her eyes locking with his, and for a moment, he felt a strange connection. It wasn't just pity. It was something deeper, something raw. She was no longer just a lost child. She was a survivor, and in that moment, she held more power than he could understand. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. Her voice was so soft, so fragile, it seemed as though she were afraid of breaking. "But I'm not sure how to trust anyone again." The human nodded slowly. He understood that. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially not after what she had been through. He wasn't sure how to fix this, how to make her believe that he was different, that he wasn't like the invaders who had destroyed everything she had ever known. "I don't know what happened to your people," he said, his voice steady, "but I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you. You're not alone anymore." The girl seemed to consider his words for a moment, her eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. The silence stretched between them like a delicate thread, fragile and waiting to snap. Then, just as he thought she might look away again, her expression softened. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know if I can ever believe that, but thank you." For the first time since he had found her, the human felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose, a desire to protect her, no matter what the cost. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There were dangers out there, things neither of them could predict. The storm outside might eventually pass, but the storm within her, her memories, her pain, her anger would take much longer to settle. And yet, in that moment, he made a vow to himself, no matter how difficult the journey would be, he would be there. He would protect her, even if it meant facing dangers he couldn't yet imagine. The world outside may have been hostile, but in that room, they had found something that had been lost for so long: hope. The wind howled relentlessly outside, but inside, the room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional crackle from the fire. The human sat close to the girl, still unsure of what to do next. But one thing was clear: there was no going back now. Their lives were intertwined, however strange that might have seemed only a few hours ago. The girl's past, her survival instinct, they all painted a picture of someone much older than her years, someone who had already seen too much. They hadn't spoken much after the promise he made. The girl seemed lost in her thoughts, her gaze distant, as if the weight of the world hung on her every move. The human couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying something far heavier than her fragile frame should be able to bear. And yet, she was still here, still breathing, still alive. Suddenly, her voice pierced the silence, soft but clear. "I can feel them coming," she said, her words sending a chill down his spine. He turned toward her, heart racing. "Who?" The question was out before he could stop it, but he already had a sinking feeling that he knew the answer. "The invaders," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the fire, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her small body trembling ever so slightly. "They know I'm still alive. They won't stop until they find me." The human's stomach tightened. He had feared this. The dread that had been growing in the pit of his stomach now had a name, and it was bigger than anything he had anticipated. Whoever these invaders were, they weren't just after her, they were after everything she represented. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a key, and that key was something they would go to any lengths to possess. He glanced at the window. The storm outside was as fierce as ever, but he knew it wouldn't keep anyone out for long. The thought of facing these invaders, whatever they were, filled him with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The girl seemed to read his thoughts. "They will come, no matter the storm," she said, her voice steady now, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of what was coming. "And when they do, they will not stop until they have what they want." The man's heart raced. He stood up, pacing back and forth, trying to think of any plan, any possible way to protect her. But the more he thought, the more hopeless it seemed. He didn't have weapons, and he wasn't trained to fight. His only advantage was time, but how much time did they have? "What do we do?" he finally asked, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. The girl's eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time, there was something almost like a spark of determination in her gaze. "We run," she said simply. "We leave before they find us. If we stay here, we'll be trapped." The words hit him like a wave. He had no idea where they could go. There was nowhere safe, no place that would guarantee her protection. But something in her eyes told him that there was no choice. She had faced loss, pain, and fear before, but this time, it wasn't just her life at stake. He nodded slowly. "Then we run," he said, more to himself than to her. It was the only option, the only choice. The girl stood up, her small form steady and resolute. There was no time to waste. The fire might have been their only warmth, but the real heat now was the danger closing in from outside. They had to move, and fast. The road ahead was unclear, but there was no turning back. The invaders were coming, and they would have to face them together. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the unknown. The human and the alien child stood in the small, dimly lit room, the fire long since reduced to nothing but glowing embers. The storm outside raged, but their focus was on the next move, whatever it was. There was no safety in staying where they were. They had to leave. The girl, despite her fragile appearance, seemed to have already made up her mind. She moved with a quiet confidence now, her steps sure and deliberate as she approached the door. Her face, though young, held a determination that seemed beyond her years, a resilience that the human could only admire. "You know they'll come for us," he said, the reality settling in his chest like a stone. His voice was steady, but his thoughts raced. They didn't have weapons, only the clothes on their backs and the fragile knowledge she had of the world she had left behind. How would they fight an enemy they couldn't even see? How would they survive against something so much more powerful than either of them? The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on the door. "They will, but they won't find us if we don't let them. If we move quickly." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We have to trust each other now. We don't have another choice." The human swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a survivalist. He had never been in a situation like this before. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a child who was somehow more prepared for what was to come than he could ever be. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior in her own right, shaped by losses and challenges that were beyond his understanding. "I'm with you," he said at last, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. He didn't fully understand what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave her. Not now. Not after everything she had shared with him. She offered him a small, grateful smile, though it was tinged with sadness. There was so much she had already lost, and now she was asking him to help her face yet another danger, something far greater than they could imagine. But for the first time since meeting her, the human felt a spark of purpose ignite within him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about more than just staying alive. This was about fighting for someone who had already fought too much, someone who had nothing left but the strength to push forward. The girl turned back toward the door, motioning for him to follow. She stepped out into the storm, the cold wind biting at their faces as they walked into the night. The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, covering their footprints as if to erase any trace of their existence. They were leaving behind the shelter they had found, but it didn't matter. The real shelter was the trust they had in each other, the quiet bond that had formed between them. Together, they moved through the darkness, the weight of the world heavy on their shoulders. They didn't know what lay ahead. They didn't know if they would survive. But they knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't face it alone. The invaders were out there, searching, relentless. But they weren't ready for what they had become. Together, they were something more than just two survivors. They were a force, and the storm would not stop them. Not now, not ever.